Hi, I'm Doug, and this is the Orange VT1000 valve tester. While in fact this unit is a valve tester, we actually prefer to see it more as kind of the missing link that connects virtually anyone who has anything to do with the tube amp, literally from the point of manufacture all the way through the point that that amp is resold. So for manufacturers, there's a lot of appeal about this unit. It means you can have virtually anybody in your factory testing and sorting tubes to the standards of your own choosing, literally on a scale of 1 to 15. And this trickles down to the distributor and the retailer because it means that the end user is going to have a chance to have an extremely consistent experience, whether an amp was made last week, this week, or next week, regardless of whether they're buying in a store or online. So the VT1000 costs less than my vintage tube screamer and has a tremendous amount of appeal for my fellow guitar players. In the same way we love to constantly add pedals to our pedal board, I think it's important to point out a couple of really important things. Distortion pedals kind of imitate the sound of your preamp distortion, and overdrive pedals have a tendency to imitate the sound of power amp and power amp tube distortion, which means the ability to regulate your own tubes, mix and match your own choice for preamp tubes and power amp tubes is tremendously powerful and gives us the ability to do inside the amplifier what we do already on our pedal boards. If that sounds a little too technical, think about it this way. I think most players have had a night where their tone was just perfect and forgot maybe to document where the settings were and then kind of came back like, oh no, something's changed. Or maybe something hasn't changed. And it's important to point out that basically your tubes are in a constant state of decline. So being able to measure where they are on that perfect night, or at least use that as a basis to try and get your tubes to the point where you want them to, is one of the real values of this unit for the player. So this is where it starts to get fun. A buddy of mine loaned me this, it's got a Sovtech case, but it's really a Mullard. And he's not getting it back, unless he asks real nice. In any case, I don't know much about this tube, other than it's a vintage Mullard. And you just kind of stick it in the appropriate socket. There we go. Turn the unit on. You select the appropriate type, like that. It's actually already set for an ECC83/12AX7. And as you kind of go down here, you can see the appropriate marking for the different tubes. And to test the tube, you just simply hit that button. So this Mullard came back as a pretty much perfect example of why people love vintage tubes. First of all, it came back as a pass as opposed to a warn or a fail, technically described as good. And on a scale from 1 to 15, the gain came back as what I would describe as a perfect 8. Now the VT1000 actually measures a couple of different things. Overall gain, but it measures the gain for both sides of the valve. And because it's a solid 8, it means both sides came back at an 8, which is really good. If, for example, you saw a light flashing next to the 7, that would tell you that the left-hand side of the valve was a 7, and then a solid light at the 8 would mean the right-hand side was at an 8, which is still a good rating, but because it's kind of right in the center and it's a perfect 8, this is a great tube to start testing your amp with. So in a drawer, I've had 3 12AX7/ECC83s sitting around for a couple of years. Different manufacturers, which means even with the same value, they're probably going to sound different. But I tested them. And what's neat is I was able to kind of identify not only the type of tubes, which is written on the tube itself, the brand, also written on the tube, but I was also able to come up with a gain value. And what's neat is I found out that the groove tube came back as a perfect 7, nice tube. The electro-harmonics came back as a 7/8, also a very nice tube. And the Mullard came back as an 8/9, a little bit hotter. In pedal speak, that basically means that this guy right here is my groove tube, give or take. This guy right there was my electro-harmonics, and that guy was my Mullard. Probably I'd be inclined to try the Mullard first, but the point being that I'm able to take these vintage tubes and not so vintage tubes that have been lying around that I don't really know anything about, quantify their gain, and know a lot about them without actually having to plug them into the amplifier. And traditionally, if we wanted to actually find something out about them, we put them in the amp. I think that sounds like that. Pull it out. All right, let's try the other one. I think I was that. And then do it with the third one. And by the time you get to the third one, you forgot what the first one sounded like. This completely changes everything. Although you can roll preamp tubes at will when it comes to changing power amp tubes, it's really a good idea to have your amp biased, even if you're taking the same type of tube and replacing it with a like type. That is, unless you're using the Orange OV4, which is a self-biasing kit. This is actually the new self-fit kit. Very cool, and pretty much any type of tube that you could want to swap, replace, mix, and match, you can use with the OV4 without having to do anything other than just putting the tube in. If you're not using an OV4, it's really important that you buy matched pairs or quads of tubes. If you blow a tube, you have to replace the entire set. The other thing is, it's probably a really good idea to test your power tubes/valves on a somewhat regular basis. While the fireworks you just witnessed might be kind of exciting to watch, it's not very nice to see that happen in your amplifier. And it's one of the things that testing your tubes on the VT1000 on a somewhat regular basis will help prevent, especially in combination with a unit like the OV4. Most power tubes/valves are categorized into three main groupings: early distortion, average, and late distortion. And as the name implies, early distortion tubes have a tendency to distort earlier. They, generally speaking, have less volume and they have less headroom. What's neat about the VT1000 is it enables you to test not only the gain of tubes, but also to match them. Testing or matching pairs or quads of power amp tubes is essentially the same process that we already did for the 12AX7/ECC83s. You put the tube in the appropriate socket, you select the type, and you start the test. Now these are two EL34s from Ruby that I tested. What's kind of cool is they shipped from Ruby as a match pair. Orange tested them, and they tested as a match pair, and after a bunch of use, they're still perfectly matched as a 9, which places them as average. Again, the lower the rating, the faster it's going to be in terms of distortion, early distortion. The higher the rating, the slower it's going to be to distort, so that's going to be late distortion. These are kind of right in the middle, and if you're kind of looking for a starting place, that's a great place to start. Now again, as we're crafting our tone with our preamp tubes, the higher the rating, the more distortion. With our power amp tubes, the lower the rating, the more distortion. So what we're learning to do is kind of craft distortion in different sections of the amplifier by using these values, and that is tremendously powerful. So I don't pretend to be an expert on tubes or valves, as our British friends might say, but the great thing about the VT1000 is you don't have to be to use it. Thanks so much for checking this out. Cheers.